Welcome to Hoax Hunter. I'm John Houston. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Philadelphia experiment. I must bring this story up because there are still many that consider this story to be a fact. For those of you who are already familiar with this story, I assure you, you will learn something new in this episode. The Philadelphia experiment goes as follows. During World War II, the U.S. Navy conducted a top-secret experiment involving magnetic fields. An experimental electromagnetic device was used. This device was based on the technology of a working version of Einstein's unified field theory. The subject of the experiment was Cannon-class destroyer escort DE-173, also known as the USS Eldridge. The date was October 28, 1943. The location was the Philadelphia Harbor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The U.S. Navy, with the help of Einstein, were attempting what had never been attempted, achieving complete invisibility of a physical object. The object was the USS Eldridge, with a complete crew of Navy personnel. As the electromagnetic device was turned on, a force field, green in color, began to appear around the ship. The force field extended 300 feet from each beam of the ship. The beam of the USS Eldridge is 36 feet. The field was spherical in shape. As the field became brighter and brighter and more visible, the USS Eldridge and the crew became more and more vague. Those that were near the field were able to see the shape of the ship's hull in the water below. Within moments, the USS Eldridge had become completely invisible. Complete invisibility was not the only result of this experiment. The USS Eldridge had also jumped through time and space. When the USS Eldridge disappeared from its harbor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it reappeared in a different harbor in Norfolk, Virginia. It was seen there for a few minutes, and then it disappeared and reappeared in its original Philadelphia harbor. When the USS Eldridge had reappeared in Philadelphia, a horrifying side effect had taken place among its crewmen. Some of the crew became fused with the ship itself. It's as if the crew went to one dimension and the ship went to another, and when they reunited, some of the crew had merged with the ship. This was not the only side effect. Half of the crew suffered from insanity, and a few other crew members suffered from a different form of ailment, known as getting stuck or going blank. A man stricken with going blank needed constant scientific supervision regarding his magnetic field, or else he would fade away into a different dimension. This supposedly happened to some of the crewmen. The result of the experiment was complete invisibility of the USS Eldridge and all of its crew while at sea. This experiment proved that there is a unified magnetic field in all substances of the universe. The U.S. Navy halted the research because of the terrifying effects that it had on the crew. According to the story, Einstein did complete his unified field theory, or theory of everything. Einstein supposedly claimed his theory was incomplete because of the results of the Philadelphia experiment. He felt it was too dangerous for mankind. Who was the eyewitness that came forward with this story? Where did this story originate from? Along with many other investigations, I have come to the same conclusion, that this story originated from one solitary individual. His name is Carl Allen. He is better known as Carlos Allende, and because of this, from this point on, I will refer to him as Mr. Allende. Who was Mr. Allende? He was born on May 31st, 1925, in Springdale, Pennsylvania, to Harry and Mary Allen. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II, and then later the Merchant Marines. He lived in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Mexico. Mr. Allende died in Greeley, Colorado, in March of 1994. He is best known for his Allende letters, which would introduce the world to the Philadelphia experiment. It all started in 1955 when Carlos Allende began reading a book entitled The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup. Mr. Allende was clearly intrigued by this book, and he wrote the author, Morris K. Jessup, 4 letters. The first letter involved levitation. Its whereabouts are unknown. The second letter is postmarked January 13th, 1956. The third letter was sent a few days later, and the last letter was postmarked May 25th, 1956. The earliest known record of the Philadelphia experiment is in these letters from Mr. Allende to Mr. Jessup. The following is an excerpt of these letters. The result was complete invisibility of a ship, destroyer type, and all of its crew while at sea, October 1943. The field was effective in an oblate spheroidal shape extending 100 yards, more or less due to lunar position and latitude, out from each beam of the ship. Any person within that sphere became vague in form, but he too observed those persons aboard that ship as though they too were of the same state, yet were walking upon nothing. Any person without that sphere could see nothing save the clearly defined shape of the ship's hull in the water, providing, of course, that the person was just close enough to see, yet just barely outside of the field. Why tell you now? Very simple. If you choose to go mad, then you would reveal this information. Half of the officers and crew of that ship are at present mad as hatters. A few are even yet confined to certain areas where they may receive trained scientific aid, where they either go blank or go blank and get stuck. Going bland, i.e. an after effect of the man having been within the field too much, is not at all an unpleasant experience to healthily curious sailors. However, it is when also they get stuck that they call it hell incorporated. The man thusly stricken cannot move of his own volition unless two or more of those who are within the field go and touch him quickly, else he freezes. Very disrespectfully yours, Carl M. Allen. I wish to mention that somehow also the experimental ship disappeared from its Philadelphia dock, and only a very few minutes later appeared at its other dock in the Norfolk, Newport, New Portsmouth area. This was distinctly and clearly identified as being that place, but the ship then again disappeared and went back to its Philadelphia dock in only a very few minutes or less. This was also noted in newspapers, but I forgot what paper I read it in or when it happened. Probably late in the experiments, may have been in 1956 after experiments were discontinued. I cannot say for sure. The records of the U.S. Maritime Service House, Norfolk, Virginia, for graduated seamen of their schools will reveal who was assigned to the SS Andrew Faruseth for a month of either late September or October 1943. I remember positively of one other observer who stood beside me when tests were going on. He was from New England, brown blonde curly hair, blue eyes, don't remember name. I leave it up to you to decide if further work shall be put into this or not, and write this in hopes there will be. Very sincerely, Carl M. Allen. I am a stargazer, Mr. Jessup. I make no bones about this, and the fact that I feel that if handled properly, i.e. presented to people in science in the proper psychologically effective manner, I feel sure that man will go where he now dreams of being, to the stars, via the form of transport that the Navy accidentally stumbled upon, to their embarrassment, when their experiment ship took off and popped up a minute or so later on several hundred sea-travel trip miles away at another of its berths in the Chesapeake Bay area. I read of this in another newspaper, and only by hypnosis could any man remember all the details of which paper, date of occurrence, and etc. You see, and perhaps already the Navy has used this accident of transport to build your UFOs. It is a logical advance from any standpoint. What do you think? Very respectfully, Carl Allen. Morris K. Jessup didn't take these letters very seriously, but Mr. Allende's obsession with his book continued. Mr. Allende wrote notes all throughout his copy of the book. He wrote in 3 different colors of ink: green, blue, and purple. The strange thing about these notes is Mr. Allende wrote from the perspective of 3 separate individual extraterrestrials who claimed to know the secrets of the universe. Mr. Allende felt these notes were of great importance, so in April of 1956 he decided to mail his personal copy of the book, including his notations, to the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. This is where the story began. Until this point, no one had taken Mr. Allende's crazy ideas seriously. The book was passed around the research department in the Navy, and it eventually found its way to a contractor of the Navy named Vero. Vero decided to print up a limited number of copies of the case for the UFO, including Allende's notes. This copy is known as the Vero edition. It is freely available online at the moment, and I will post a link in the comments section. The following is an excerpt of these notes. Note: anyone reading this book would have to know that electron quantums within molecular structures are similar in scope of field as planets' orbits. They would have to know that electrons in metal go across what in planetary systems would be billions of miles, leaving 3 a gravitational field, dead spot or node, or vortice or neutral, as this one thing is variously called. Realizing this, as Dr. Albert Einstein did, it shows clearly how solids may become energy or dissolute, and how they may pass easily out of visual scope instantly. This is merely one clue gleaned from Einstein's theory of a unified magnetic field through all substances and throughout whole intergalactic universe. U.S. experiments 1943 on one part of it proved plenty. Mr. A, page 14. U.S. Navy's force field experiments 1943 October produced invisibility of crew and ship. Fearsome results, so terrifying as to, fortunately, halt further research. Mr. A, page 27. Ethereal types similar to results of Navy experiments in force field invisibility, 1943 solids go through them. No harm to occupants at all. Mr. A, page 83. Tried that with blank and I on blank, and he blank was drunk enough to slip out of the freeze, and he made them know it in no uncertain terms. They put us down and then unfroze the crew, who to this day do not remember it. They can't. Mr. M was chief mate. Hatteras, 1943. Mr. B, page 94. X's crossed out by Jimmy. Perhaps they detected field activity of Navy DE, which was close by, before testing an invisibility experimental gadget. Mr. A, page 94. Little men do not remember to always remain visible. When embarrassed, they go pop, and thus they hide. Reason repeated HFE ship state gives LMS this ability. Thus now you see overall wisdom of Einstein's retraction of his unified field theory. In U.S. Navy's ship invisibility experiments 1943, results of such uninformed tinkering seemed to show the correctness of his reason for retraction. Jemmy, page 150. In a letter dated April 1st, 1959, Vero writes of sending head of Project Blue Book, Captain Ed Rappelt, a copy of the Vero edition. In it, they reveal that 1 year earlier, the Vero edition was first published. Dear Colonel Rappelt, remembering your great interest in UFOs, I have finally succeeded in obtaining your address so I could send you a copy of a book we reprinted about a year ago. An explanation of its source is contained in the introduction. The book is being sent by separate mail. I hope you enjoy the notations added to Mr. Jessup's originals. Sincerely, Austin M. Stanton. On April 20th, 1959, Morris K. Jessup died. The official report declared his death a suicide. Morris K. Jessup is best known for his connection to the Philadelphia experiment. The Case for the UFO was his best-selling book, but during his lifetime it did not sell many copies. The death of Morris K. Jessup sparked curiosity in the UFO community. It was not until after his death that his book received widespread attention, specifically the Vero edition. The UFO community speculated that Mr. Jessup's death was a murder because he knew too much. But the fact is, Morris K. Jessup was recently divorced, and after his divorce he was in a car accident which he never fully recovered from. In addition to this, he wasn't selling many books, and his publisher rejected his later manuscripts. Such were the circumstances of Morris K. Jessup. He was depressed, and understandably so. The death of Mr. Jessup inspired many to sell books about the Philadelphia experiment, including the parts with Mr. Allende and Vero. But they used the death of Mr. Jessup as a hook to sell their books, which I find disrespectful. In 1963, Vincent Gaddis published a non-fiction book entitled Invisible Horizons, The Mysteries of the Sea. In it, he relates the Philadelphia experiment as written about in the notes of the Vero edition. In 1978, George Simpson and Neil Berger published a novel entitled Thin Air. It is a fictional thriller that was influenced by the Philadelphia experiment story. On March 30th, 1978, Mr. Allende mailed a copy of the Vero edition to his parents. In a handwritten letter dated March 30th, 1978, Carlos Allende wrote his parents the following. Dear Dad and Mom, enclosed is a book I co-authored with Professor Morris K. Jessup of the University of Michigan nigh 24 years ago. Do not ever never part with this book because its original price was $25 3 years ago when this third reprint of it was printed, but now, as it is a very limited edition, the price has actually doubled, as have many other things in those inflation-plagued days. And so this book I helped to write alone by myself, with me, Mr. A or Mr. B, is now worth $52.50. Yes, $52.50, tax included. It started out at my insistence with the U.S. government's Office of Naval Research scientists, and then printers, to be only for our scientists, and even then only for U.S. government Navy scientists of the Office of Naval Research and Development, and in short was for about 12 years an absolutely secret book, never meant for public eyes, not even for any other scientific eyes, except the scientists of Office of Naval Research. It was until the NASA Soyuz Apollo space mission of 2 Julys ago, the world's very most dangerous book or so, scientists themselves tell me. However, during the Apollo-Soyuz space mission, an invisible star, was discovered, and so now reluctantly, all science worldwide knows that 21 or more years ago, I knew that force fields plus UV light cause the faint invisibility found in that truly invisible star. I herefore, as all science knows, what I have known and kept secret for nigh 23 years, it is not such a totally dangerous book at all, and so you now be allowed to be read by public eyes. Much love, your son, Carl M. Allen, C.M. Allende. P.S. I have autographed this copy only for you with both my names, Allen and Allende. Love, Jr. Mr. Carlos Allende was clearly very proud of having co-authored the Vero edition with Morris K. Jessup. In this letter, Mr. Allende clearly admits to being Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jimmy, the author of the notes in the Vero edition. Mr. Allende clearly confesses that he alone, beside the late Morris K. Jessup, authored the notes. A book I co-authored with Professor Morris K. Jessup. This book I helped to write alone by myself, with me, Mr. A or Mr. B. In 1979, Charles Berlitz and William Moore published a book entitled The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, which purports it is a true story. As more books are written on the Philadelphia Experiment, Mr. Allende writes more letters to the authors. Mr. Allende was unable to earn more than a few $100s talking about his story, while others were profiting greatly. On September 8, 1996, the U.S. Navy officially declared the following. ONR has never conducted any investigations on invisibility, either in 1943 or at any other time. ONR was established in 1946. In view of present scientific knowledge, ONR scientists do not believe that such an experiment could be possible except in the realm of science fiction. When the U.S. Navy officially responds by saying it never happened, the UFO community says, of course they would say that. They're the government, it's their job to lie. While I disagree that the government has never conducted any type of invisibility experiment, I do agree that the Philadelphia experiment is science fiction, specifically the science fiction written by Mr. Carlos Allende. Hopefully the UFO community would accept the opinion of acclaimed ufologist and author of the Mothman prophecies, John Keel. I give thanks to Robert Gorman, whom without I would not have access to these letters. The following letter was written from John Keel to Robert Gorman on August 10, 1981. The purpose of this letter is to outline once and for all time my own observations and sometimes innocent involvement in the Allende affair. First, Morris K. Jessup personally regarded the Vero document as a joke. He openly scoffed at it. Shortly before his suicide, Jessup wrote a long, rambling letter to Long John Nebel, a New York radio personality, and similar letters to a few others including Hans Stefan Sanderson, editor of a science fiction magazine. These were typical pre-suicide letters of a depressive personality. While there are some odd things about the way the authorities in Florida behaved in handling his death, there is absolutely no doubt that Jessup ended his own life because of career setbacks and family problems. Just before he killed himself, he turned over his correspondence with Allende and his personal copy of the Vero document to Mr. Sanderson. He had made many notations of his own in the margins of the Vero book, all of them questioning the validity of A and B's comments, and generally ridiculing their efforts. He felt the whole thing was a waste of time and money, and that Allende was a mental case. In 1966, Sanderson turned over the Jessup file to Ivan Sanderson because the latter was writing Uninvited Visitors, a UFO book, and had been receiving letters from Mr. Allende. On a visit to Ivan's farm that year, I sat up all night reading this material with great fascination. My conclusion, like Jessup's, was that the Vero book was a work of a schizophrenic, a dual personality. Sometime in the late 1960s, I referred to Allende in some of my magazine articles. I soon began to receive letters from Mr. Allende himself. I was openly skeptical and asked him to prove his identity. He sent me photostats of his Siemens papers, tax records, and other documents, including a signed postcard he had received from Jessup. Around that time, he had visited the Lorenzens in Tucson, Arizona, and had spent an afternoon with them. He presented them with a copy of the Vero book and freely admitted to them that he had written all the annotations. In writing to me and describing his visit, he complained about Coral Lorenzen's legendary rudeness and claimed that she and her family left him sitting in the living room while they all went into the kitchen to eat dinner. In a rather haughty letter to me later, Coral confirmed this visit and boasted that she always knew the whole thing was a hoax. But here is a very important point that you and all the others have mangled for years. Vero was behind the hoax, not Allende or anyone else. Jessup, Sanderson, Sanderson, myself, and everyone else knew that Allende had written the annotations. Allende admitted on many occasions to many people. One set of notations was written in his handwriting. The other set was probably written with his other hand and thus disguised. The introduction of the Vero document tried to make a bigger mystery out of the whole thing. The Vero secretary who typed the thing up is the perpetrator of the real hoax. Allende's letters to me, mostly mailed from Mexico, were clearly the work of a very unstable personality. For example, one 15-page letter begins with high praise, declaring that I was the best thing ever to happen to ufology, etc., but as the letter progressed, Allende argued with himself, and by the last page he was calling me names and telling me that he would never write to me again under any circumstances. You must realize that I have received thousands of truly crackpot letters over the years, and I'm something of an expert. Allende's letters confirmed my earlier conclusions that we were dealing with a rampantly schizoid personality. However, you must also realize that I could never state this in print because no editor would dare print it. The fear of a libel suit would be too great. Considering the man's mental state, I'm sure that his letters to Jessup were sincere, and that when he annotated Jessup's book and mailed it to the Naval Office, he thought that he was offering some valid information. He never expected it to snowball into a celebrated cause. Jessup suggested that the Navy throw the book into a wastebasket. Instead, they passed it on to the nest of UFO believers at Vero. Later, Allende presented himself at Vero and was given copies of the book. He sent me correspondence he had with Vero's president. He told them that he had written all the notations. Anyone who offers the true facts about the non-existent Philadelphia experiment will be shouted down as a pawn of the Air Force conspiracy. Like 90% of the UFO lore, there never was anything to it. But Carl Allen was not a conscious hoaxer. If anything, he is one of ufology's biggest victims. All the best, John A. Keel. I agree with most of what John Keel said in this letter, specifically that Mr. Allende was an unstable personality. If diagnosed, he may have been schizophrenic in nature. I believe Carlos Allende believed in what he wrote about because of his nature, but he was clearly a talented individual because he wrote the Philadelphia Experiment, a story interesting enough to be repeated in many books and movies. There is a TV movie currently in production entitled The Philadelphia Experiment in 2012, and it is starring Malcolm McDowell. I look forward to see what they do with Mr. Allende's story. Carlos Allende died in March of 1994. In August of 1986, he offered a deathbed confession, 8 years before his death. In it, Mr. Allende alleges that Albert Einstein taught him about the physics of invisibility for 2.5 weeks. He continued to claim the story was real, and he offered new details that were clearly constructed by someone who had read everything anyone had ever written on the subject. He claimed it started out as an experiment in degaussing ships so they wouldn't attract mines. This was never mentioned in Mr. Allende's previous story, but it was mentioned later by ufologist Jacques Vallée. Vallée's response to the Philadelphia experiment was that it was no more than a misunderstanding of normal operations involving the degaussing of a ship. Degaussing involves a powerful electromagnetic generator which reduces the magnetic field of the ship, making it invisible to torpedoes and mines. Because degaussing was not common knowledge in 1943, someone witnessing it without knowing what it was could understandably think it was a secret experiment. On September 16, 1981, Carlos Allende wrote his father the following letter. In a handwritten letter dated September 16, 1981, Carlos Allende wrote his father the following. Dear Dad, the enclosed is my private personal property, and until I get back home, please save this along with my other papers and documents. The enclosed could win me the Copernicus Prize in astrophysics, a prize worth many thousands of dollars, but solely if this is saved, so that I myself can prove I wrote it. Sincerely your son, Carlos Miguel Allende. Carlos Allende wanted his legacy to be an extension of Einstein's unified field theory. He felt his notes were enough of a breakthrough to earn him an award in astrophysics. Mr. Allende clearly believed in the science behind his own science fiction. I would like to end this episode with an excerpt of the last Allende letter, dated May 25, 1956. Well, all this fantastically preposterous sort of rubbish will be necessary to feel that certain pull of curiosity about this thing that, to me, is irresistible. I want to crack this thing wide open. My reasons are simply to enable more work to be done upon this field theory. I missed this until recently. In the last Allende letter, Mr. Allende actually confesses that the story he's been telling is rubbish. He not only confesses that the story is fake, but he confesses why he is telling a fake story. Well, all this fantastically preposterous sort of rubbish will be necessary to feel that certain pull of curiosity about this thing that, to me, is irresistible. I want to crack this thing wide open. My reasons are simply to enable more work to be done upon this field theory. Mr. Allende wanted to build enough hype and buzz in the scientific community around the incomplete unified field theory that he would actually be solved. Mr. Allende wanted more than anything in the world to solve Einstein's incomplete unified field theory. He wanted the mystery to be solved. He thought that if we as a human race could solve the puzzle of the theory of everything, that we could have the technology of the stars, of invisibility, anti-gravity, teleportation, everything. Perhaps he was right. I'm John Houston with Hoax Hunter. Be seeing you.